Electrotherapy for drug addiction. The idea that electrical stimulation to the head could be beneficial in the treatment of drug addiction was derived primarily from the work of Dr. Margaret Patterson, a British surgeon. About 15 years ago, she came to my laboratory with an interesting story. While she was completing her surgical training at a British hospital in Hong Kong, a Chinese surgeon had shown her the auricular acupuncture, a technique that uses points on the patient's ear. Could be used in place of the usual large doses of narcotics to prevent withdrawal syndrome in postoperative drug addicts. This technique so impressed Dr. Patterson that she began to use it on her patients there. She then returned to England where she built up a busy surgical practice. Later, with the increase of drug addiction in England, Dr. Patterson began using postoperative acupuncture on those cases. Her fame spread, and patients began to consult her primarily for acupuncture treatment of drug addiction. When she learned of the Chinese use of electrical stimulation to enhance the effect of acupuncture, Dr. Patterson adopted that technique using pulse DC. However, she encountered problems. While the clinical results were better, there was considerable local irritation from the current, and it was difficult to keep the needles in place in the ear. Nevertheless, she believed that this was a useful treatment for drug addiction and that it was better than any other, and she began seeking a method that would obviate these difficulties. When she visited my laboratory, Dr. Patterson told me of these problems, and I asked if I could suggest a way to improve the technique. My sole contribution was to recommend that she stopped using needle electrodes and instead use a flat surface electrode of at least 1 square centimeter in size, applied to the skin just behind the ear. I told her I thought that only about 1% of the total current she was applying to the needle electrodes actually traversed the brain, but that this appeared to be enough to do the job. It seemed to me that the effects of her electrical acupuncture treatment were probably not mediated by the acupuncture system at all, but were somehow due to the electrical currents acting differently on the brain. I suggested that she explore various frequencies to determine whether any were more effective than others, and also whether any could be related to addiction to a specific drug. She followed this advice, and since then we have kept in close contact. A few years ago, I visited England and examined a number of Dr. Patterson's patients. What I found was amazing. Even severely addicted patients could completely stop all drugs as soon as the electrodes were applied, and they showed no sign of withdrawal symptoms. However, I was most impressed by the fact that every patient reported having experienced a major change in personality during their 6 weeks treatment. All of them believed that during the treatment time, they had gone from being addictive to non-addictive personality types. In animal experiments, Dr. Patterson had found that during electrical treatment, the amount of the brain's endorphins, a natural morphine-like substance produced by the brain, increases measurably. While this may explain some of the immediate results, it cannot be the only answer because the majority of her patients require only one 6 week treatment and remain drug free thereafter. It seemed likely that there is one long term effect that persists after treatment is stopped. There are several interesting aspects to this technique. First, it seems that very low levels of pulsed electrical current have major effects upon the highest functions of the brain. The personality alteration that follows the treatment is a most significant observation that urgently requires further study. Second, from all accounts, this treatment is so superior to others for drug addiction that it certainly deserves a large-scale scientific study to determine its actual clinical utility. From 1944 to 1950, when I worked at Bellevue Hospital in New York City, one of the largest and busiest hospitals in the United States, I saw very few drug addicts, despite the fact that this was a time of great social and economic stress. I need not indicate the seriousness of the drug problem today. Yet, to the best of my knowledge, not one study has been done to address the question of the cause of the increased demand for addictive drugs. Instead, we have viewed the problem as being produced by an increased supply. and we have therefore based our countermeasures on interdicting the supply of illicit drugs. Unlike other treatment methods, Dr. Patterson seems capable of actually decreasing the demand for the drugs. It has been used with great success in the treatment of prominent British rock stars, but has not yet been approved for the treatment of the average citizen. Dr. Patterson's discussions with the NIH and the FDA in this country have so far been unfruitful. While I generally take the position that all electromagnetic therapy has a dark side and should be used with great caution, I also believe in risk-benefit analysis if the condition for which the treatment is to be employed is life-threatening. If no other therapies have the same level of effectiveness, and if the risk of producing undesirable side effects are less than those of no treatment at all, then the use of electromagnetic therapy is justified. The use of Dr. Patterson's treatment for severe drug addiction would seem to be justified by this risk-benefit ratio concept. At the least, a large-scale clinical study should be undertaken to either prove or disprove her observations. A large number of addicts are currently being treated at a high cost by a variety of people who are using different types of TENS units or other devices, including some that produce pulsing magnetic fields applied to the head. Not only is this unscientific, but it's also dangerous. There is even darker side to this situation. If we can treat drug addiction by passing an electrical current through the head or exposing the head to a strong pulsing magnetic field, then we should be able to mimic the side effects of certain illicit drugs such as psychedelics or opiates using the same technique. This idea has in fact become common, and it has been used in a technique called in drug culture, wireheading. The plans for these kind of devices circulate freely, and the electronics store can provide the materials to construct a simple but powerful pulse generator for this purpose. The practice is not strictly illegal, and I doubt that it can be controlled in any legal fashion. It is, however, decidedly dangerous. A year or so ago, I received a call from a gentleman who works in the music industry and who had worked with a young man who had formerly been a serious drug addict. The two had discussed the possibility of using electronic devices to mimic drug effects. The former addict believed that the use of such devices would be safe. Because they would not produce a dependency response, music studios use multi-track magnetic tape for recordings. In order for the tape to be reused, it must be degaussed. That is, placed in the field of powerful electromagnetic oscillating at 60 Hz to erase the prior recording. The young man decided to test his theory, and he applied degaussing coils to each side of his head. Over the next hour, he became increasingly psychologically disturbed and had to be hospitalized that evening. He was not able to return to work for several months, and by that time he had lost all memory of the incident. I do not know if a similar reaction would occur in a subject who had not previously been seriously addicted, but I do not recommend anyone's doing this or any related experiment. Electricity and the healing of bone fractures. The FDA's approval in 1978 of several types of electrical and electromagnetic devices for stimulating the healing of human bone fractures that have failed to heal has played a major role in gaining acceptance for electrotherapeutics in general. More than 100,000 patients have been treated in this country and abroad with these devices. The industry has continued to produce new types of devices, and it has been aggressively searching for an expanded market and treatments for other conditions. The way in which this all began is an interesting and instructive story. In 1960, I presented my data on the electrical factors related to salamander limb regeneration at the annual meeting of the Orthopedic Research Society. After my presentation, Dr. Andrew Bassett, a young orthopedic surgeon from the Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons, introduced himself to me and suggested that we work together on possible electrical factors in bones and in bone healing. We began a joint study within a few months, with our first project being a search for a piezoelectric effect in bone. The piezoelectric effect is the generation of the electrical charge in some crystalline materials produced by bending or pressing on these materials. The charge is produced instantaneously and rapidly diminishes to zero. When the bending or pressure is released, the same amount of instantaneous charge is produced in the opposite direction. Piezoelectric crystals are frequently used to produce sparks to light propane stoves and other similar devices. Bone has three types of growth: the increase in length and thickness during childhood, the healing of fractures, and the response to mechanical stress. This third type indicates that bone is somehow able to sense mechanical stress and grow so as to produce an anatomical structure best able to resist the stress. Because bone is composed of two different materials, a protein fiber called collagen and a mineral crystal called apatite. We theorized that the mineral crystals might be piezoelectric, thereby providing the ability to sense mechanical stress. After some investigating, we were able to show that bone is capable of producing the piezoelectric effect. However, the two charges from bending and releasing were not equal, suggesting that another factor was operating to limit or rectify the current flow in one direction. Electronic devices called rectifiers or diodes, which are based on single crystals of various types, pass electrical current in one direction only. If an alternating current or a series of alternating pulses, as from piezoelectric crystals, applied to the input terminal of a diode, only those portions of the current going in one direction will come out of the output terminal. Not all diodes are equally efficient. Some pass a part of the current going in the reverse direction. This was what seemed to be happening in bone that was being repeatedly stressed. However, one might not expect a biological system composed of millions of tiny crystals to work quite as well as a large single crystal. By 1964, we were able to describe the control system regulating bone growth that occurs in response to mechanical stress and that operates on the basis of the piezoelectric effect. It is important that the piezoelectric effect in bone be partially rectified and produce a signal that has more current going in one direction. This imbalance in the electrical output provides the direction in which new bone must be built. If the effect were the same as that from a single large crystal going equally in both directions, there would be no directionality, and it would be useless as a control system signal. Stress-related bone growth is actually remodeling of the shape of a bone so that it can be better resist mechanical stress. The piezoelectric effect tells the bone how much stress is being applied and in what direction. The mechanisms associated with this type of bone growth and the cellular events that bring it about are totally different from those involved in fracture healing. I make a point of this because many people, a majority of orthopedic surgeons included, have confused the two, turning on bone growth electrically. In the same year, we began experiments on stimulating bone growth using direct electrical current, which is very different from the short, transient pulses associated with the piezoelectric effect. The idea of using DC rather than the piezoelectric types pulses was based on my original observation that negative DC current was required for regeneration in the salamander. By then, Bassett had acquired a skilled electrical technician, Robert Pollock, who made the devices we used. These were small, about half an inch long, battery-powered units with two platinum electrodes each. The units were implanted so that both electrodes enter the marrow cavity of intact, non-fractured thigh bones in adult dogs. When Pollock asked me how much current the devices should produce, I had to say that I really did not know. So we had to make some educated guesses. We settled on three different current levels: 1, 10, and 100 microamperes. In this way, we hoped to cover the possible range of effective values. Pollock measured the current from each unit for about 30 minutes following its implantation in the dog's leg. Over that short period of time, he found that the current from each of the devices decreased substantially so that in reality, we were using about 3 microamperes maximum from the three types of units. The experiment ran for 21 days. At the end, we found that a large mass of bone had grown in the marrow cavity around the negative electrode at 3 microamps, and a slightly smaller amount had grown around the 1 microamp negative electrode. No difference was found between the 1/4 microamp negative electrode and simple control electrodes with no current. There was some apparent loss of bone in the vicinity of the positive electrodes, but this was difficult to quantify. As we neared the end of both the piezoelectric and DC bone growth projects, we discovered that both experts had been done there before, although not in exactly the same manner, by several Japanese scientists. Our ideas were therefore not new, and our data had been anticipated by the work of other scientists. Nevertheless, our two reports stimulated great interest in the orthopedic community. Unfortunately, however, our work was widely misinterpreted. Little attention was paid to its most important aspect, which was that for the first time in the history of biology or medicine, a normal growth process had been deliberately turned on. Until then, nature alone had held the key. Most people also confuse the production of bone growth by negative DC with the pulsed piezoelectric effect, and thus they concluded that bone could be electrically stimulated simply because it was piezoelectric. This was interpreted to mean that the application of these electrical currents in the body would have an effect only on bone, not on any other tissue. The fact that we had not stimulated bone growth itself, but had actually produced an activation of bone marrow cells and their subsequent transformation into bone was ignored. In retrospect, I see that we were in part responsible for this because we did not emphasize these points and indicate their significance. The result of the simplistic interpretation of our work was the popular idea that bone was unique in its response to electrical factors, that negative electrodes stimulated bone growth in some magical way, and that the effective level of current was about 10 microamperes. Some orthopedic surgeons seemed to think that these data were sufficient for them to begin clinical usage of the technique. I did not agree with this view. In my laboratory, we concentrated on the basic aspects of the relationship of electrical forces with all types of growth, as well as with other physiological systems, particularly the nervous system. In 1970, we were able to report the details of the complete DC electrical control that governed fracture healing in frogs. The scientific literature in 1970 indicated that frogs healed their fractures in the same fashion as humans, by cell division, which produced new bone-forming cells. However, we found that this was not quite correct for either frogs or humans. We were able to show the fracture healing is basically a regenerative process that involves the electrical de-differentiation of certain cells. In frogs, the red blood cells in the blood clot at the fracture site are de-differentiated by the DC electrical current and subsequently re-differentiated into bone-forming cells. The red blood cells of the frogs still contain their nucleus, so they still have all their genetic information and can de-differentiate. Our red cells do not have a nucleus, hence, they cannot de-differentiate. In the human being, the cells of the bone marrow are also electrically de-differentiated and subsequently re-differentiated as bone cells. Actually, this was the process that Bassett and I experimentally produced in our first experiment with dogs. We were able to describe the details of the cellular process and show that it is produced only by extremely small levels of voltage and current. In this case, more is definitely not better. We also were able to show that a frog's red blood cells can be electrically de-differentiated in culture dishes, and that they have the biochemical markers for de-differentiating turned on cells. Most importantly, we were able to show that the electrical control signal responsible for the bone healing process begins at the time of the fracture, runs for a fairly definite period of time, and then declines to zero. The time sequence of this negative DC current is similar to that in the regenerating salamander limb. This is an important observation because it explains why fractures sometimes fail to heal, resulting in what orthopedic surgeons call a non-union. The DC current produced at the fracture stimulates the dedifferentiated cells of a human bone marrow just as it does in the cells of the salamander's limb or in the red blood cells in the frog's fracture hematoma. When this DC current system returns to zero, cellular stimulation ceases and healing stops. If the two ends of a fractured bone in a human are separated or are permitted to move, the cellular healing process, which still proceeds normally at each end of the broken bone, will not be able to make a connection across the fracture gap. If the bone has not connected across the fracture gap with the stimulating DC electrical current has run its course and dropped to zero. The result is a non-union. Surgery and bone grafting procedures actually restart this electrical control system because they injure the bone and re-stimulate the DC electrical control system. Therefore, to stimulate the natural DC fracture healing system with externally generated electrical forces, one has to apply the appropriate amount of negative DC electrical current to the cells of the bone marrow at the fracture site. Our colleagues in the orthopedic community were less interested in this type of basic work than in bringing this technology to clinical fruition. In 1971, Dr. Zachary Friedenberg of the University of Pennsylvania reported the first successful electrical treatment of a non-union of a fracture in a human. He used 10 microamps of DC current with a stainless steel negative electrode embedded directly in the bone marrow at the fracture site. This promising beginning was rapidly expanded by Dr. Carl Brighton, Dr. Friedenberg's colleague, through the establishment of a clinical research program based upon the same technique. Shortly thereafter, Bassett and his colleagues proposed an alternate technique that did not require surgery and that was based on the induction of electrical currents in the bone by means of an external pulsing magnetic field. I was certain that a pulsed electromagnetic field, or PEMF, would simply produce a pulsed alternating electrical current in the bone, and that this could not stimulate the bone marrow cells to dedifferentiate. Furthermore, the pulsing magnetic field itself would permeate the tissues around the fracture site, and its own biological effect might be considerable. Nevertheless, Bassett and his co-workers thought that the use of an unbalanced magnetic pulse would produce the equivalent of a pulsing DC field in which the bone was primarily exposed to a negatively charged electrical environment. The possibility that the magnetic field had any biological action was simply discarded. Their animal experiments seemed to validate this idea. Fresh fractures exposed to the pulse magnetic field healed significantly faster than normal. The healing time was determined by exposing the bones to mechanical stress at various times. If the fracture was healed, the amount of mechanical stress required to break it was within the range of that for non-fractured bones. While this is a very accurate method for determining the time of mechanical healing, it tells us nothing about the cellular mechanisms involved. Following FDA approval, these techniques were used clinically. Despite obvious differences in technique, they were found to produce identical success rates of about 80% in inducing bone growth in human patients. I was of the opinion that the available scientific data were insufficient to warrant FDA approval of these devices. None of the proponents of any device had described the cellular responses produced by the particular technique involved. The 10 microampere level of current in the DC devices had been assumed to be optimal. As a result, no other current levels had been investigated. No one had determined whether electrolysis was being produced, and the potential biological effects of the pulsed electromagnetic field had not been assessed in the PEMF device. I decided to try to accurately measure the level of voltage at which overt electrolysis occurred in mammalian tissues. We found that this varied with the types of metal used for the electrode. However, the average electrolysis voltage was disturbingly low. For example, the stainless steel electrodes used clinically started producing gas at 1.1 volts of DC current. The current level that was used clinically, 2 microamperes, required voltages well above this level. This meant that the devices in clinical use were producing damage and even death in cells at the treatment site. I postulated that the mechanism of action in these devices was the production of a local injury with reactive bone growth, then occurring in response to the injury. This certainly was not a biologically desirable action, and it was unrelated to restarting the normal healing process when this had failed. Our measurements of healing fractures in animals indicated that much smaller voltages and currents were used by the body's growth control system. I believed that we should be able to use these same electrical values and produce bone healing without damage. In a series of clinical cases, we were able to show that the same rate of success could be obtained using silver electrodes with currents 100 times lower than those in use, and with voltages below electrolysis levels. Instead of 10 microamperes, we used 0.1 microampere, and we proved that this minute current voltage level would still cause bone growth and healing of the non-union. The silver electrodes were important because their low resistance permitted the use of low voltages for passing the desired current level. I believe that with this technique, we were actually turning on the growth control system rather than overloading the system with far too much energy and thus producing damage. Linking electrical currents and cancer growth. It seemed to me that any electrical technique capable of stimulating bone growth might also stimulate other types of growth. In 1981, I experimented with human cancer cells in culture, exposing them to levels of DC current equivalent to those present in the area of soft tissue outside of a bone union treated with the 10 microampere technique. And the current flow of the implanted electrode to the skin electrode exposes large volumes of tissue to currents and voltages that are below those producing electrolysis, but that are still capable of causing the turning on of a growth process. The cancer cells exposed to these electrical factors grew at least 300% faster than the controls. I was supposed to find that this significant increase in growth occurred at both the negative and the positive electrodes. All of the preceding experiments had shown that growth was associated with negative polarity and the cessation of growth with positive polarity. Until I did this experiment, I had believed that cancer cells might increase their growth rate with negative electricity, but that positive electricity might show or even stop their growth. This experiment showed that cancer cells were really different from normal cells. Further, it showed that the DC current devices approved by the FDA were promoters of cancer growth. I reported my results in one of the orthopedic journals, pointing out that the approved DC current techniques might stimulate the growth of an unsuspected cancer anywhere within the current pathway. In 1981, a team of Japanese investigators reported that the mouse bone cancer cells treated with the same DC technique increased their DNA synthesis, a measure of cell multiplication, by about 200%, substantiating my results. How pulsed electromagnetic fields work. PEMFs, PEMFS, plural S. In 1983, Dr. Abraham Liboff, a professor of physics at Oakland University, reported that the effect of pulsed electromagnetic fields on normal cells in mitosis was an increase in the synthesis of DNA. Furthermore, he said that this effect was due to the magnetic field and not to any induced electrical currents. Experiments in other laboratories quickly confirmed Liboff's observations. This effect was clearly due to the magnetic field, and it occurred only in cells in active growth. This explained why the clinical reports of the efficacy of the PEMF technique varied so greatly. Some clinicians reported the usual 80% success rate, while others reported almost a zero rate. The success rate depended upon when the clinician declared a fracture to be a non-union. If this decision was reached early in the clinical course, at 3 months after the fracture, for example, active cell growth was still occurring that could be stimulated by the pulsed magnetic field. If the clinician was conservative and waited until any chance of normal healing had caused, there was no active cellular multiplication at the fracture site, and the pulsed field would have no effect. The mechanism of growth stimulation by pulsed magnetic fields was a magnetic effect on cells in active mitosis, not a turning of the normal DC growth cell control system. Also, in 1983, a Japanese investigator using an actual therapeutic PIMF device reported a major increase in the growth of cancer cells in culture, as well as an increase in the malignant characteristics of these cells. Cancer cells in mitosis were more sensitive to magnetic fields than normal cells. In response to these reports, I wrote the FDA and suggested that the agency reappraise its present approval. The FDA representatives who replied indicated that they were aware of the reports. However, because the 4-year follow-up studies on patients treated with these devices had not been completed, they considered the database to be incomplete and they took no action. Since then, I have consulted with the several medical device manufacturers who were preparing other elliptical bone growth stimulating devices for submission to the FDA. The data each manufacturer was required to submit included a report of the effect of the device on cancer cells in culture. All of these manufacturers reported a significant increase in cancer cell growth. Nevertheless, FDA granted approval for clinical testing to prove efficacy only. Some years ago, I expressed the opinion that overenthusiastic application of the electrical and electromagnetic bone growth stimulation techniques could lead to disaster if it resulted in harmful side effects. Such an event would prevent acceptance of any electromagnetic therapy in the future. One can only hope that the present circumstance will not prove me correct. The lesson still be learned is that we must work with nature rather than trying to improve on it. The history of electrotherapy in cancer. Exactly when electricity was first used as a possible treatment for cancer is unknown. The quotation from Dr. A. Allison at the beginning of this chapter is taken from his letter to Lancet of January 10th, 1880, in which he described a case which he had treated. His patient was an English farmer who had developed a cancer of the lower lip and chin. The patient had agreed to the surgery performed on the lesion, but before it could be performed, he was struck by lightning while working in the fields. Dr. Allison was called and found the patient in a state of great prostration. When the farmer regained his senses, the doctor bled him from the arm. In his letter, Dr. Allison went on to state, "That seems to be the most astonishing feature in the case is the healing process which was set up in the lip and chin soon after the accident. The cancer gradually lessened, and in a few weeks, every trace of the disease structure gradually disappeared. For 10 years, he enjoyed complete freedom from his former suffering and signs of the disease." In reading this account more than 100 years later, I believe that the most significant aspect of the case was the gradual disappearance of the cancer. One must assume that Dr. Allison was a careful observer and therefore that the cancer was not likely killed by a direct action of the electrical discharge, which would have turned it black and necrotic. The gradual disappearance would seem to indicate the operation of another factor, one that was set in motion by the severe electrical injury. To my mind, Dr. Allison's plea for testing to the fullest extent to the curative effects of frictional electricity remains well known. To the best of my knowledge, electricity was first used for this purpose in a scientific manner later in the 1880s by Professor Apostoli, a French surgeon. Even though anesthesia had been discovered in 1848, surgical techniques had lagged behind, and in 1880s, non-surgical techniques were still preferred for treating cancers of the cervix and uterus. The Apostoles treated these types of tumors with DC electricity, inserting the positive electrode into the tumor and passing between 100 and 250 milliamperes of current through the tumor to a large negative electrode on the abdomen. Clearly, he was producing electrolysis within the tumor. He reported prompt relief of pain and bleeding and shrinkage of the tumors, but reported no long-term results. Sometime around 1960, I was given an old book, The Autobiography of Dr. Franklin H. Martin. Martin had been a young surgeon in the 1880s and had gone on to considerable prominence in American surgery. He had become interested in Apostoli's method of treatment, and in the book, he described his experiences in using his technique on his patients. Martin was able to confirm Apostoli's results. He published several papers on the method, acquiring a certain notoriety in the process. A few years later, according to Martin, there was intimation that the use of electricity in the region of the pelvis would destroy the fertile ovum, or the embryo in the process of development, that careless use would terminate pregnancy. Martin characteristically decided to look into this. Using fertile chicken eggs, he found that the direct current of only 20 milliamps destroyed the chick embryos. He therefore immediately discarded this method of treatment. Martin became caught up in the subsequent remarkable development of surgery. And by 1900, he was involved in devising new and radical surgical techniques for cancer and in establishing the American College of Surgeons, as well as some major medical journals. The only future references to work on electrotherapeutics in his book are remarks decrying the entry of quackery into his field, which he still considered promising. Modern electrotherapy for cancer. As knowledge of the physics of electricity increased and better methods for generating and measuring it were developed, all rapidly growing tissues were found to be negative in polarity compared with the rest of the body. The highest negativity was found in malignant tumors. Based on these observations, Doctors Carol Humphrey and E.H. Seal of Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory postulated that cancer growth could be speeded up by negative currents and slowed down by positive currents. The report, published in 1959, seemed to support this idea. Their study involved mice that had a rapidly growing cancer implanted just beneath the skin of the back. The DC electrical application was begun 24 hours after implantation. The cancer cells were just beginning to grow at this time. Humphrey and Seal used surface electrodes of either copper or zinc, applied directly over the cancer implant size with currents far lower than those that had been used by Martin. They found that they could not make the cancers grow any faster than usual with negative electrodes, but they did report a significant growth retardation when positive electrodes were applied over the tumor. While the surface electrodes did not produce electrolysis, ions of copper or zinc were released from each positive electrode and were driven into the tumor cells by the voltage. Copper and zinc are both known to be toxic to cells, and this is most likely the mechanism involved in the results obtained by Humphrey and Seal. The experiment would have been clearer if the tumor cells had been allowed to grow for several more days, producing a noticeable mass. Humphrey and Seal suggests that continuation of the studies with other types of tumors would be desirable, but apparently they never did this follow-up themselves. In 1977, Doctors Muriel Schabel and Mutaz Habal of State University of New York Upstate Medical Center reported on basically the same type of study, using rats with implanted tumors. In this study, however, the treatment electrodes were stainless steel needles inserted directly into the tumor. Schabel and Habel used 3 levels of current, 3 milliamperes, half milliampere, and a third, much smaller level. Of 960 millimicroamperes. They also studied the effects of both positive and negative currents on the tumors at each current level. With the 3 milliamperes current, there was significant destruction of the tumor at both positive and negative electrodes, with about twice as much at the positive as at the negative. At the half milliamperes level, there is also destruction of the tumor, but only with the positive electrode. At the lowest level of current, there was a reduction in the weight of tumors, both positive and negative electrodes, but there was no tumor destruction. The number of size of tumors in other parts of the body which had spread from the main tumor via the bloodstream were reduced in the animals treated with 3 milliamperes of positive current, but not in those treated with the negative current. However, a similar finding was noted with both positive and negative treatments using the smallest level of current. Consistency would require that some similar effect would have been noted at current levels between the highest and lowest currents. However, this was not the case. At this time, the best conclusion that can be drawn from this experiment is that the tumor destruction was the result of local electrolysis at the needle electrode. The observation of the metastasis are interesting but difficult to evaluate. The metastases were not directly exposed to the electrical currents, and we must therefore assume that effects on them were due to the effects on the primary tumor. Tumor necrosis factor was not known at the time, but it appears conceivable that it might be produced by necrosis of the primary tumor. Nothing more was heard of this type of study until recently when Professor Bjorn Nordstrom, a radiologist at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden, published his book postulating biologically closed electric circuits. Nordstrom became interested in bioelectricity when he observed the structure of a lung tumor on X-rays. The radiating lines extended out from such tumors reminded him of electrical corona, and he began an investigation of many years' duration into the movements of electrical currents in the body. It is not possible to review here the entirety of Nordstrom's work, which covers a large area of bioelectricity. In essence, his basic concept of closed electrical current circuits is complex, but appears to have little support biologically or in the scientific literature. Nordstrom's cancer treatment method differs little from those of Apostoli, Martin, or Schabel and Hobel. Nordstrom inserts stainless steel needle electrodes directly into lung tumors under X-ray visualization and applies 10 volts of positive electricity with a negative electrode applied to the skin of the chest. Many of his published X-rays show a gas bubble indicating electrolysis and general tissue destruction. The reports of all these researchers share the same defects due to the lack of attention to basic principles of physics and electrochemistry. They are derived from the information that rapidly growing tissues are electronegative and from the simple concept that positive electricity should, in some magical way, cause the cessation of the tumor growth. In Nordenstrom's case, theoretical construct was different, but the final approach was the same. However, we now know that the idea that positive electrical current inhibits cancer cell growth is incorrect.